Forests are having a moment right now. Calls from all over the world are coming in to protect old growth and to replant deforested land as a response to climate change. Activists in Brazil, Chile, Peru, the US, Australia, and Canada are all calling for government regulations to come in and end deforestation and protect the remaining old growth. In Canada, BC dominates that conversation. And for its part, the BC NDP 5 years ago promised to protect old growth. But 5 years on, there is no concrete plan in place. And the Sierra Club research showed that the proposal they did have was already insufficient. Concern for old growth isn't just a matter for tree huggers, though. Research has shown that the kind of logging practices that are commonplace in BC and have been for a very long time increase wildfire risk, increase the rate of erosion, increase flooding risk. They are terrible for biodiversity. And from a purely economic standpoint, these practices just aren't sustainable. And I mean, the case for unsustainability is pretty clear here. You can literally see the clear cuts from space on Google Earth. But that's not the story I want to tell here. If you had been following the news or had even been to BC, you would be forgiven for believing that that was the only old growth in Canada. This project began as just trying to find old growth in Ontario, and I found it. And then things got a lot more complicated. I wanted to understand why I didn't see the same levels of engagement with those forests that I saw in BC. I wanted to understand how we got here. So let's start there. How did we get here? How did I get here? So this is where I first experienced forests and got to explore them as a kid. This is my cottage in the Laurentians in Quebec. And while this does meet the basic requirements of a forest, it's got a lot of trees. This does not represent what would have been the normal looking habitat before European colonization. Now, this is not to say there's anything wrong with this place. In fact, this place has been so valuable to me, even now when I'm putting more effort into learning more about these places and more about the species that are present. However, all of this, everything you see around me, even the stuff that hasn't been flattened recently, all of this was pasture about 80 years ago when my great-grandfather bought the land. Originally, the land was bought for farming, and my great-grandfather did try. He planted red pine and jack pine plantations, which is where I got my own little treehouse. But this doesn't really represent the natural state of this forest. These monocultures, while they did excite my imagination, were really just that, monocultures, deserts where nothing much grew. And even since then, the land has changed again. So, even this doesn't really look even like the forest I grew up with. A couple years ago, there was a windstorm that came through and flattened several hillsides, which kind of sucks because it looks nothing like I used to remember it as a kid. But seeing all the new growth coming up really starts to get you thinking about different stages of forests. And there's so many different species. And it's actually been very cool to sort of help shape what this place will become. Now, while this represents a habitat that was heavily impacted by humans, there are still echoes here of something older. Something much, much older. White pines, like the one that towers over the valley at my cottage, once dominated large swaths of eastern Canada. Their immense stature and abundance would become the backbone of the Canadian economy for well over 100 years, until they were almost entirely wiped out, leaving behind the forests I grew up thinking were normal. You've heard elements of this story. The Europeans arrive and they ruin everything. But I never really understood what was there before and what was lost. When Samuel de Champlain traveled down the Ottawa River in 1615, he likely saw forests the likes of which we will never see again. The largest and most mature white pines reached over 20 stories and achieved ages over 500 years old. The amount of valuable timber that existed in the Ottawa Valley prior to 1800 was estimated at 500 billion board feet, which means nothing to me. When you do several conversions necessary to parse this with modern government data, that would be about 2% of the entire country's forest cover today. In 1920, only 0.02% of the Ottawa Valley's valuable timber remained. So even saying all those numbers really doesn't give me a good idea of what exactly we're talking about here. So let's talk about this a different way. This old map of Ottawa fascinates me because it looks so familiar. I grew up here and many of these old churches still exist. The streets are all the same, except the giant piles of lumber down by the river. There was so much lumber coming through that it made it into 1800s Google Street View. And it makes sense when you consider that Ottawa is one of, if not the largest producer of lumber in the world during the late 1800s and early 1900s. I want to emphasize here that no one really thought this was sustainable. The main method that white pine was exported as was as squared timber, which is where you take the entire tree and turn it into a giant squared piece of lumber that would then often be put up as a mast on a ship. That practice left a third of the tree on the ground where it was cut. We cut down forests of hemlock just for the bark that we'd used for tanning leather. In one case, 10,000 acres of forest were left to rot by loggers after the bark was stripped. As you might expect, these types of wasteful logging practices had consequences. Huge wildfires resulted from these practices. There was land degradation, the waterways were becoming full of logs. So in 1947, the Ontario government commissioned a study. This study was led by a former general who had just come back from World War II, and he found a system that was quite corrupt and unorganized in Ontario. For example, in the mid-1800s, members of Ontario's legislature would receive 5,000-acre land grants plus an additional 1,200 acres per child, needing only to pay admin fees. Private companies would be granted up to 1 million acre properties by the Ontario government, some of which you can see on this map. And it's just crazy to me, the size of these grants that are in some cases just given to one person or one company. Loggers would often pose as settlers, get a land allotment, deforest it, and then move on to another allotment, never actually settling in these areas. Kennedy remarked in the report that even with the forest's tremendous capacity to regenerate, white and red pine stands won't return to dominate any forests the way they once had for the next 100 years. And now, in 2026, that has largely remained true. White pines take a long time to grow, and they only really dominate an area once a lot of the other trees have died of old age. They're a climax forest species, which means that unless you're in an old-growth forest, you likely won't see a forest that is truly dominated by white pines. I know that even by today's standards, I'm something of a tree hugger, but even still, some of these passages reflected a set of values that gave me culture shock. Among the main recommendations for this 1947 report included more roads to open every major watershed in the province to logging, encourage the killing of porcupines, and find out what the minimum population is needed before the population would collapse. Ironically, it also suggested a study to figure out why moose populations were disappearing while they were logging the entire place. Different values aside, this report had a lot of good stuff in it. It recognized that these practices had been unsustainable and there needed to be a solution. It recommended forest reserves, which would ideally have sustainable logging targets. But those recommendations didn't go far enough. Ontario would go on to create a forest reserve system, but it wouldn't save the remaining stands of white pine. That job fell to a brave group of protesters in 1989 near a little town called Temagami. Temagami is a town about an hour north of North Bay. Prior to the 1970s, it would probably mostly be thought of as a logging town, if it was thought of at all. The area started becoming a popular destination for outdoor recreation after Hap Wilson, a park ranger, published several canoe route guidebooks through the area. Those guidebooks helped connect more people to the area and appreciate it as something more than just sort of an economic center for logging. In 1989, a lot of things came together. A research study found that the old-growth white pine and red pine forest near Temagami was the largest of its kind in North America. This was the first study of its kind in Ontario. At the same time, the Ontario government approved the construction of a new logging road. Red Squirrel Road would reach further into the wilderness around Temagami, almost directly towards that forest that had just been studied by researchers. The group that rose to oppose this road was a mix of local indigenous tribes, outdoors enthusiasts, scientists, and hippies, and in September 18th of 1989, they blockaded the construction. There was a notable member of that blockade, then leader of the opposition, Bob Rae, who along with 344 others was arrested for blocking the construction. The Ontario government would later quietly close the road, and Bob Rae would go on to be elected Premier of Ontario. Imagine that. A premier who was famous for protecting green spaces instead of selling them to the highest bidder. While some pockets of old growth still exist in Ontario, thanks in large part to the protesters and the consciousness they inspired, most are just remnants, and trees that come from before European colonization are exceedingly rare. I'm sort of dancing around a deeper question here. Sure, logging old growth in BC and the Amazon and Southeast Asia is causing all of these measured impacts, and we should stop. But in Ontario, it's already happened. Most of the forests are gone. The damage is done. Why focus on it? Aren't there bigger issues? Of course there are. We are in an age of ecological crises. We are seeing mass extinction at a global scale. We've created a world of monoculture deserts. We've introduced invasive species that are taking over and devastating native forest populations. Just in Canada, European buckthorn, larch sawfly, Dutch elm disease, hemlock woolly adelgid, spotted lanternflies, Asian longhorn beetles, beech bark disease, chestnut blight, emerald ash borer. I can keep going. The magnitude of the changes are staggering, and adding them all up just brings this overwhelming sense of dread. I'm trying to reach past all these symptoms of a society that's detached from the physical realities of the place it exists. I'm trying to reach towards what we as a society need to do to reconnect with the systems that keep us alive. And I think old growth is a really good vehicle to take us there. The boring definition of old growth forests are forest systems that have been going through natural processes for about 200 years. From that definition, it can be a bit hard to picture it. Would you even notice if you stepped into one? I wasn't sure either. So I went looking, and when I found it, everything about this project got more complicated. The ancient cedars I saw at Lion's Head were like living art growing out of the sides of cliffs. The oldest cedars are 1,300 years old. It's hard not to see how they escaped the saw growing out of these cliffs, but I'm not sure I would call that a forest. But there was no doubt about what I had found when I visited Owenda Park. Seeing this forest flipped a switch in my head. Some of these maples were over 250 years old, and there was nothing ordinary about them. I spent hours with them, and there was a real sense of joy just being with these monoliths covered in moss, stretched and bent in all kinds of weird ways. But the whole experience left me feeling very empty, conflicted. It is hard to describe what it feels like walking through here. Because in many ways, I'm not far away from the path I've taken many times already. Maybe part of it is because I already knew it was here, so I had in my mind already started to celebrate it. But it's just a mix of so many emotions, because part of it is just sheer wonder and curiosity, and I want to look around and find everything there is to find. And mixed in with that is this little kid energy of thinking about, what the forest in Lord of the Rings looked like, or other fantasy books my parents would read me. But there's also a definite twinge of sadness because these are so rare. And this video is not going to convince people who don't care about forests to care about forests, but it's just such a loss that more people don't have this, and that we all didn't get to experience this more when we were kids. I don't know. It's complicated. There's this concept in environmental literature called the shifting baseline syndrome. It's a pretty intuitive concept. When we lack the context for the ecosystem changes that have occurred over long spans of time, we lack the ability to assess the gravity of those changes. I'll give you an example. When I was a kid and we'd go on road trips with my family, there would be so many bugs on our windshield. Like, it would be coated. The grill would be black with bugs. But now when I go on those road trips, there's less bugs. And this is backed up by research. The bugs are dying. It's a problem. But if a kid goes on a road trip now, their conceptual baseline for those bugs is the trip they're going on right now. The trip that I know has way less bugs. And this process over time, if there isn't that generational connection with those ecosystems, is that we fail to notice the ongoing degradation of these ecosystems. I'm going to say more about the shifting baseline syndrome in a companion essay that goes with this project. But I think part of the feeling of sadness for me was realizing the scale of changes that had occurred. Suddenly I had a baseline for what forests in Ontario could have been. I was suddenly able to make that contrast, and it just felt so stark. My experience of that coming down feeling isn't unique. Researchers from Carleton University and the University of Ottawa investigated how youth went through the same process, and they framed it as sort of a hero's journey. Now, yes, this is about youth specifically, but I think a lot of us are in the same boat when it comes to climate anxiety. Now, this journey has to start from a pre-existing relationship with nature. And let's be honest with each other for a moment here. We are living in a time of incredible disengagement. Not necessarily with political issues or global issues, but with the place we exist. Each of us is now walking around with one of these demonic boxes in our pockets that seems like it was specifically designed to steal your life essence away from you when you swore you were going to be productive that morning and instead spent 2 hours on Instagram Reels or TikTok. Definitely not a personal story there. But this disconnectedness is a broader societal issue that sort of brings us back to where we started. We've been over this. Settlement in North America was predicated on notions of human domination over nature, and that hierarchical understanding hasn't gone anywhere. Industrial farming, fire suppression, the fossil fuel industry, we have never shed the idea that the limit of our geography is just an imaginary barrier. Why do we landscape with plants from other continents? Why do we have lawns? Why do we rake leaves? How do we wake up and start to think about ourselves as part of the landscape rather than conquerors of it? I don't know if there's one strategy to fix that, but I do know that the people who are going to fix that have to be the ones that do care. And those people need to survive this hero's journey, otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere. We're at shock now. Shock was where I was at after I saw those old growth trees. The feeling of hopelessness, of emptiness, of a need to do something about it. The study lays out two different coping strategies to navigate out of this anxiety brought about by climate change and ecological loss. The first is problem-focused coping. This path is what most people think of when they think of climate change protesters. It's protesting, it's joining climate action groups, it's boycotting, it's political advocacy, it's blockades like the ones that were done in Temagami and the ones that are happening right now in Fairy Creek. The authors call this section Facing the Dragon, but I wish it was a dragon. Fighting against the fundamental societal ordering of the modern world feels a lot bigger than a dragon. How do you stay motivated in your fight when the weight of global ambivalence falls on you? The second option the authors looked at was meaning-focused coping. And this is sort of the return to nature. It has the capacity to fuel you even when the fight seems hopeless. For the authors, this meaning was fostered in awe, empathy, and bonds at the identity level. So how do we develop this sense of meaning? There's no one prescription here, and it's a deeply personal thing for everybody. So what the rest of this video is going to be is me providing some of the authors, creators, places, and concepts that have helped me foster that sense of meaning and that sense of awe. And I hope they'll resonate with you as well. A concept I came across that has really helped me feel grounded in all this is deep time. And to explain it better, I'm going to bring you back to where my journey began. So we've established that this forest is not very old. It's not very representative of what might have been before this. But there are still, if you look around, echoes of what this place used to be. And I'm going to go show you probably the coolest Ice Age glacial remnant that I've ever seen. The Laurentians and pretty much almost all of Canada was once covered in a giant ice sheet. And as that ice sheet retreated, it left boulders like this, which we call glacial radicals. But sometimes the way those rocks are deposited, the way the ice treats them, creates something pretty incredible. This guy. This giant rock is probably my favorite thing in this whole place. When I was a kid, and we'd, imagine the forest as Lord of the Rings or some other fantasy setting, this rock was always important to it. It was sometimes ominous, sometimes just otherworldly, and I think that holds true to reality. I mean, it's covered in life, in lichen that's been here for who knows how long. But we know that this rock has been here since the last ice age, thousands and thousands of years ago. We might never know how exactly it came to rest like this, but I think we can assume that this rock has had different meanings given to it by different people that go back at least thousands of years. And it's just hard to think about this giant monolith covered in life just sitting here. It existed before the forest. It existed when the forest was old growth. It existed when the first people came to this place. And it's going to keep existing. Because, yeah, the forest around it, it's a young forest. It doesn't really represent what was before European colonization. But as long as this land is cared for, as long as it's held by people concerned for its well-being, this rock will stay here. And even after we're all gone, it will still probably be here, ready to take on new meanings as it goes through time. And with everything going on, that just makes me feel at peace a little bit. And whenever I get too worried about the world and the state of things, this rock just sits here. And I think that, for me, is a calming experience. Okay. So for this part of the video, it's going to be a really quick overview of some of the really cool books I've been reading that have helped to foster the sense of meaning for me, and maybe they can do that for you as well. So the first one is Robin Wall Kimmerer's The Serviceberry. Really short, really easy read. Her previous book, Braiding Sweetgrass, was also a huge influence on me. Just really helps you appreciate the ideas of reciprocity and abundance from an Indigenous perspective. Second book is How to Love a Forest by Ethan Tapper. Really cool message, really beautiful writing, and a really practical outlook on how foresters and land managers can do really practical things to improve the diversity of the lands they own and to recreate sort of old growth like patterns on a landscape. Rooted by Lyanda Lynn Hopt. This was a book that really helped me open up to sort of stepping away from this hard science stuff that sort of restricts the way you talk about things. This is about creating a way of life, a sense of spirituality with nature, and being comfortable in that space. Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, great name. I didn't talk about fungi in this video, but it really breaks down some of the amazing ways they exist within ecosystems and the amazing abilities they have to break down anthropogenic waste. There's even a short little snippet about how they've trained some mushrooms to consume cigarette butts. Really cool stuff. Really also hopeful stuff that a lot of the solutions that we need can be found in nature and don't necessarily need to be created by some mad scientist. Other Lands by Thomas Halliday. This really pushed me towards those ideas of deep time that we talked about. He goes over a bunch of ancient prehistoric ecosystems and what we know about them, and it really just connects you to the sort of depth of life that exists throughout the history of this planet. Concrete Botany, a new book from a guy called Joey Santor. He runs a YouTube channel called Crime Pays But Botany Doesn't. Foul-mouthed, like a sailor, but screams at you to recognize the absolute wonder and mystery of the natural world. Self-taught botanist, very cool. Really started to get me to start thinking more about these concepts. Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. Real cool idea about trees as communities. Helped to create the idea of the wood wide web, which has been slightly debated, but really cool idea of how nutrient cycles in the forest work and how little we understand about them. Finally, Light Eaters by Zoe Schlanger. She goes through the history of botany and starts to explore the very strange and unknown world of plant intelligence. They do all these things that interact with the world around them, but we have no idea how they do it. Really cool, starts to get your mind racing about what we don't know, which I think is almost as important as what we do know. Anyways, if there is any one author that really directed where this video has taken me and given me a sense of hope for what the future could hold, it's Diana Beresford Kroger. She's a botanist, a medical biochemist, communicator, author, and speaker for the trees. She writes about forests with a sense of wonder and sheds light on the gaps of our knowledge and the seeming impossibility of these beings who make our planet livable. Like, they eat sunlight. Her most recent book, Our Green Heart, is chock full of these stories that inspire the sense of wonder and underline the need to save these forests, to educate people about them, and to take an active part in a cultural shift. Her book made me re-examine the forests I had taken for granted. It helped me see the need for creating changes that I might not see the fruit of until I'm an old man. I have the privilege of helping steward this land and to make it a space where the magic of a diverse forest can someday be achieved again. Her message is a simple one. Find a place to plant one today. Do the same the next year and for the 4 years that follow. These saplings and our children will go hand in hand into the future. So clearly she's talking about trees. This whole video is talking about trees. And I know planting a tree kind of feels a little flat at the end of this, but it doesn't have to be a literal tree. This video is about planting the idea that there is something more to love about the place you are. It's asking you to try and love the place you are, not the things we've done to that place to alter it or change it or warp it to our needs, but the real place. Every ecosystem on Earth is a shared creation of a bunch of beings over millions of years of evolution forming these complex relationships with each other. And I couldn't find a better example of that than in an old-growth forest. These ancient trees are draped in life, even the dead ones. And when you see like the peak of what these places can become, the relationships become a lot clearer. You can't really see that in a young forest. You can't see that on your front lawn. Look, I'm not naive to the challenges in front of us. I understand that I have a privilege to have this land that I can help steward and choose what to do with. And I know a lot of us just struggle to pay rent. But it costs nothing to recognize that we share this planet with other beings who deserve to live, that we need to live. There is no forest without the trees. There's no field without the grass. There's no ocean without plankton. There's no food web without bugs. There's no art, religion, philosophy, microwaves, Ford F-150s, Artemis 2, Tamagotchis, Instagram without 3.5 billion years of life on this planet that has been fostered and struggled and overcame to give us everything we know of in this universe. We are not alone, and we never have been.